YouTube, Dawson Rider here. Welcome to my review for episode 13 of Gavv. And this was basically a very solid one-parter to a kind of two-parter cake form debut. I have some interesting thoughts on this being the first time we've had some back-to-back-to-back form debuts, which is kind of funny. But overall, it was a good episode. I liked it. Anyways, guys, until next time. Just kidding. So, we start the episode and it's about cake. It's another one of those episodes that I think does a good job of making an ability form memorable through a memorable little storyline, and it ties back to Gavv's memories of learning about cake, which are sparked by Sachika making a cake, but it's like a roll cake, and he's like, that's not how cake's supposed to look. It's not supposed to look like a roll. They want you to take the rolls! Thumbs up if you get that reference. And then he has a memory of like learning about cake, and then also ties into the storyline about the twins, about the twins coming after him, because they apparently just have always hated him. I mean, obviously he's been shunned by his family for the most part in general, but they particularly seem to hate him. So I'm really curious what that's about. But there's a flashback of them all eating, and they have like gross granite cake, and you see kind of the granite foods. It kind of looks like alien food, kind of reminds me of some of the alien food for whatever reason from Galaxy Quest. But that's interesting just because it does call back to when they were eating basically like colorless slop back in the past when on Boom Boonger mode, when Shoma was first experiencing human food, and people were saying how that was tied to they didn't want Gavv's abilities to come out when he ate actual food that would produce little gachizo or whatever they would produce. It doesn't make any sense because he didn't have those abilities until he was messed with, unless that was after he was messed with. Regardless, though, my thought in the past was actually that they ate, like it was going to tie into some sort of cheesy message that the Granite family ate, like, flavorless food or whatever, because it would, like, fuel their power, but then you find out that the actual powerful food comes from, like, the joyous food that he eats, if that makes any sense. Like, the fact that he's actually finding enjoyment from it created more powerful stuff than them just forcing themselves to eat crappy food. I don't know, that's what I thought, so it's interesting to note that basically he was just getting crappy food, and they had actual real food, at least for their planet. And I thought they did a good job of tying that whole storyline into this endearing little storyline about him, tying back to the twins, and it also gives a memorable storyline for this cake form because it does produce the little gachizo for the roll cake form. And I think it's interesting because this is a lead into our first super form, which I forgot to make a video talking about when we first saw it, but it's a really cool looking form. I'll talk about it more next week when we get the debut. But I think it's interesting to have a debut of a super form tied directly back to back with an ability form, which is kind of weird. Like, I have some slight mixed feelings on it. I'll be honest, the back-to-back-to-back debuts of Donut, Cake 1, and Super Cake doesn't bother me all that much. Like, it's a very minor nitpick, if you can even call it a nitpick. Like, the show's been so good about it, and I think they did a really good job of crafting a memorable personal story for him and Sachika for this form. And it's actually kind of interesting that that ability form leads into the super form. The only thing I worry about is just that form getting lost in the shuffle, because usually in Rider series as we go along, once the super forms make debuts, you kind of forget about the ability forms. So that's the only thing I worry about. That is, I will remember this storyline because it was all tied together, but I just think that form might fall by the wayside when it's kind of jumbled with a super form, and that's just kind of interesting. I've never seen that happen before. And it also did that thing that Gotchard did that I complained about when I was praising Gavv for having gaps between their forms, where Gotchard would do that weird thing where the debut episode for an ability form would not feature it taking out the monster. He would transform into the ability form for a hot minute, and then transform into the ability form from the previous episode and finish it off, which led to many of the ability forms being forgettable. And I thought it was interesting that they sort of did that this week, but in my opinion, a better way, because during the fight, he basically transformed into olive forms, kind of in a, I'm throwing everything at them moment. Every weapon, every mode we've got, and it just wasn't working. And he did mostly end off trying to use the cake form. He seemed to transform into the main form at the end to shield himself, but I think they did a good job of having him access other forms during this debut, and it still made this form memorable. And it's a pretty cool looking form, like all the other forms. I think it's pretty well designed. I think the roll cake axe is pretty awesome and hits that sweet spot, pun intended. Well, was it? Of, kind of silly, stupid, but also kind of awesome at the same time. And the fight was super entertaining. I mean, the fights have been really great in the series overall, like I've said, like right on the caliber with Boom Boonger, but in particular, this fight felt really epic with all the switching between the forms and the jumping around and the effects. It just looked really good. And we end on a cliffhanger and be like, oh no, is Gavv gonna die? Yes, next week's the last episode, and then the villains are gonna win. No, he was in the preview. But nice little cliffhanger there. Some other little notes, there's lots of other little stuff going on. Valen was investigating this monster of the week that he fought that's been kidnapping people for 20 years, and he was asking him about the person that killed his mom because he's been around so long. There's still not a lot of focus, but a surprising amount of focus on the writer's reputation. I'll be curious what that amounts to. I can't remember a time in recent years where that was really important. There was that little mini arc at the very end of Gotchard when everyone found out about the Chemi stuff. And then in Geats, stuff happened later on, but for most of the series, it was, kept a secret because they kept resetting and stuff like that. So I'm curious if that's going to amount to anything. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of the memory wipe story in Gotchard. Like, it was something that kept coming up that I was like, okay, this is going to have to amount to something because it keeps coming up. And then the only other thing I wanted to make note of was there was a scene very early on. Well, two things I want to make note of. One of them is important, one of them is kind of frivolous. But early on in the episode, Stroma goes to visit his uncle and is asking, like, basically how it's possible for Valen to exist. And he says, I can't imagine that humans have the knowledge to do this. It'd have to be granite. So I'll be curious if that means that maybe the shady scientist guy is a granite. I still think he's human, and that he just for some reason is connected to some really shady stuff with the granite, and that maybe his uncle just saying, like, oh, humans couldn't do it is just arrogance or ignorance or whatever. But it's worth noting that they brought that up. So it's possible that he is some sort of granite, the shady guy that made Valen's abilities. And the only other note I had, which is kind of unimportant, but I just want to say I still really love how well they're using the Gachizo in this series. Like, I love how he uses them for little investigations. It's also really weird that it, like, cries out like a little screen onto the phone. But also even when they're trying to, like, kick his brother and sister when they're attacking him, they did such a good job. Like, they're not memorable in the sense that I have a favorite one, like, oh yeah, Jim, my favorite Gachizo. But just as a group, they've been such a memorable little endearing gimmick. I really like it. So, yeah. Really good two-parter, or beginning to a two-parter rather. Still some slight mixed feelings about them back-to-back-to-backing, but I think Gavv has earned enough goodwill that it doesn't really bother me. I just thought it was worth noting because it's the first time that they've really had back-to-back stuff. But honestly, setting aside the back-to-back cake forms, I didn't even feel the fact that this was debuting after the donut form. Anyways, guys, until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for my videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.